My name is Michael Grover. I'm an Assistant Vice President here at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. I work in the Community Development Department and have been here for about 19 years working on community development issues ranging from affordable housing to early childhood development and other things that the Minneapolis Fed focuses on. We're here today to provide some information about the proposed rulemaking around the Community Reinvestment Act. We're really excited to be able to talk about specifically this session, which is focused on CDFIs, MDIs, WDIs, and LICUs. So I know that's an alphabetical soup or an acronym soup mix. Community development financial institutions, minority depository institutions, women depository institutions, and low-income credit unions. Really excited to talk about what's happening in that space around the proposed rulemaking. In addition, what we have planned for today is to provide a little bit of a primer on CRA as it currently exists. We're going to start with that, and then we're going to move on to focusing really with regard to the NPR, where these different organizations are being cited in the proposed rule. And then certainly our goal today ultimately is to encourage you to provide feedback to the agencies, and we'll have information later on about that to the agencies directly in comment letters, in comments via email, and other ways of doing things. So that's our ultimate goal today, is to encourage you to do that. One other housekeeping issue as it relates to Zoom, we do have a chat function. We're going to be, if you have questions or comments as we go along, do not use the Q&A function. Use the chat function to be able to communicate with presenters. We will, if questions come around that are more clarifying questions, we will try and get those in the flow of the presentations today. If they're broader questions, we may reserve those to the end, especially if they're focused specifically on the NPR. So hopefully that is enough information before we get started here. I will be passing it on to Molly Majurley, my colleague here at the Minneapolis Fed, to get us started. So Molly, if you want to start your camera and go off mute, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Michael. So my name is Molly Majurley. I'm a supervisory examiner in the consumer affairs area of the Minneapolis Supervision and Regulation area. So the whole reason that I came to the Federal Reserve was actually based on CRA and the Community Reinvestment Act. And I've been here for 27 years and am happy to be with you today. So as Michael said, we're going to do a brief overview of CRA as it is currently. Some of this may be repetitious for some of you, but for others, it's always a good refresher and primer. So with that, Michael, let's go to our first slide. So the Community Reinvestment Act is a seminal piece of legislation that was enacted by Congress in 1977 and to address systemic inequities in access to credit. So CRA requires the Federal Reserve and other federal banking regulators, the Comptroller of the Currency and the FDIC, to encourage financial institutions to lend in the communities where they take their deposits from. It remains an important tool today to address income inequality. And CRA does link to the civil rights laws of the 1960s and 70s when the Civil Rights Act was enacted in 1964, the Fair Housing Act in 1968, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act in 1974, and the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act in 1975. So those laws said that discrimination based on certain factors such as race, color, national origin was illegal. And so CRA created an affirmative obligation for banks to serve their local communities, including those areas that are low and moderate income. So CRA, while it does try to address some racial inequity, it's really based on the income characteristics of borrowers and neighborhoods. So we evaluate the Federal Reserve and the other federal regulators, as I mentioned, the OCC, which is responsible for regulating national banks, and the FDIC, which Also, with the Federal Reserve, regulates state member banks depending on how their charter is addressed, are responsible for CRA. And we do have research that has shown that CRA has had a positive impact on access to capital and financial services, and that the law encourages banks to be important partners in broader efforts to revitalize communities across the country. So I think as we get into the proposal and how it's going to address activities with CDFIs and MDIs and WDIs and LICUs, I think this is an important piece of the proposal to help further that. So our next slide. So the framework for evaluating a bank's CRA performance is kind of based on these four key points. The facts and data. So we consider facts about banks lending, could be their home mortgage lending if they're required to report their data on that. But we also look at their lending data even if they are not a reporter. The performance context. So performance context includes understanding the demographic data on incomes, the makeup of the neighborhoods in the bank's assessment areas, the cost of living, the overall economic climate. It helps us as regulators and examiners identify particular community needs as well as opportunities. And it also helps us understand the financial institution as well, if they have particular capacity or financial constraints, and any safety and soundness limitations that may impact their ability to lend in their assessment areas. Moving on to assessment areas, they define the community for the purpose of evaluating CRA. So generally, the assessment area is the geographical area that includes all of the bank's offices, the main office and its branches, and deposit-taking ATMs. The area must also be where the bank makes a majority of its loans. Finally, banks have to define assessment areas that do not arbitrarily exclude lower moderate income areas or reflect illegal discrimination, such as by arbitrarily excluding areas where the minority population is significant. The other thing to understand is how we define low and moderate income. So that's criteria that's defined by the US Census Bureau. And low income is less than 50% of median family income. Moderate income is between 50 and 80% of median family income. Middle income is between 80 and 120%, and upper income is over 120% of the median family income. So the median family income for metropolitan, there's a median family income for metropolitan statistical areas for each area. And then if a person or geography is in a state outside an MSA in a state, then there's a statewide non-metropolitan median family income. All right. And then for the size and scope, we can move on to the next slide. So the evaluation of a bank's activities depends on its asset size. So for small banks, which currently have assets less than 346 million, they're just subject to a lending test. An intermediate small bank, which is 346 million up to 1.384 billion, is subject to the same lending test that small banks are, and then a combined community development test. And that combined community development test, we look at the bank's community development loans, its community development investments, which include donations, and its community development services. And that as a whole, and that's one part of, so there's a rating for the lending test and then a rating for the combined community development test, which then rolls up into an overall rating. For large banks, they're subject to a lending test, and that lending test includes community development lending, and then an investment test and a service test. We can go on to the next slide. All right, so the agencies recognize that for community development, there's a wide range of community development activities. However, the regulations encourage financial institutions to focus their community development efforts on the needs of LMI individuals and areas. So currently, community development is defined as affordable housing for low and moderate income persons, community services targeted primarily to low and moderate income persons, economic development activities that help finance small businesses or farms that provide job training, and revitalize or stabilization activities. And under the revitalize and stabilization activities, that can be revitalizing or stabilizing lower moderate income areas, distressed or underserved areas, and or federally declared disaster areas. And we'll get into the definitions in a little bit. So I'll expand on that a little bit. So affordable housing must benefit or be likely to benefit lower moderate income individuals. And then again, using those definitions that I mentioned previously, the 50 and 80% of median family income. Community services must be targeted to LMI families and not just serve LMI families by chance. So if we're talking about a daycare providing services, if a bank is providing services to a daycare, the daycare would need to be targeting LMI families, not just have LMI families in their census by chance. Let's see. And then while we talked about, so the economic development, financing small businesses or farms, or that provide job training, and basically focusing on job training that will benefit low and moderate income individuals or help them move up the spectrum as well. So to get a little bit more into the revitalize and stabilize, that again, for just, oh, I lost my definition for distressed and underserved. I'm sorry. Here we go. So distressed tracts are, so these are determined annually, and it's based on the poverty rate. And if the poverty rate is over 20%, or the unemployment rate is 1.5 times the national average, or there's population loss of 5% or more in the preceding 5 years, those middle income, non-metropolitan middle income census tracts are considered distressed. And underserved middle income, non-metropolitan middle income census tract is where the population is sufficiently small, thin, and distant from a population center, and there would be difficulty financing fixed costs of meeting essential community needs like infrastructure or schools or hospitals. And those are based on USDA economic research factors. Okay, we can move to the next slide. So some current examples of CD investments would be investments in CDFIs, investments in loan pools for low or moderate income borrowers or small businesses. So that could be a loan pool that would be financing mortgages that are for lower moderate income borrowers or in lower moderate income areas specifically. State or local bonds for community development projects. So as we were talking about revitalize and stabilize, often school bonds in rural areas, if they're distressed and or underserved, those often receive CRA credit. Low-income housing tax credits are also an example of a CD investment, as well as investing in small business investment companies, which are part of the SBA's work in working with small businesses. We want to go to the next slide. So some current examples of CD services. So currently, one key factor that involves CD services is that it has to relate to the provision of financial services. So that would be, a banker's service on a board or committee, if they're on the finance committee, or they're serving on the board and working through, the revenues for a nonprofit organization, that would count as a service. Participation in an IDA program. So an IDA is an individual development account. They're sponsored through various organizations. It's a way for an individual to have a savings account with a specific purpose, such as starting a business, paying for education, or saving for a down payment to buy a home. And under this program, funds that the individual deposits into that savings account are then matched, sometimes 2-to-1 or often 1-to-1, according to the specific program terms. And then, so then once they reach their goal, then they can use those funds. Other things, providing technical skills as human resources, IT services, legal or other expertise are all current examples of CD services. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael to talk about the transition to the new CRA.
So Molly discussed the current CRA and where and what banks are currently examined under. And now I'm going to provide a little bit of a transition to talk about where we're headed in terms of the future CRA. The current period of CRA modernization began in 2018 when the OCC issued its advance notice of proposed rulemaking, its ANPR. And the FDIC, the OCC, as well as the Fed did a lot of outreach related to that ANPR to gather information from the communities and from stakeholders about what should be the focus of the final rule. The Fed did its own ANPR on October 19th of 2020. And more recently, the OCC rescinded its 2020 CRA rule, which was finalized in 2021 at the end of December. The goal there is to really have the three agencies in alignment going forward. And that happened when they came together to issue the notice of proposed rulemaking on May 5th. So that started the clock ticking in terms of gathering information and gathering feedback from stakeholders in the community, like yourselves. And the public comment period ends on August 5th in 2022, so just a couple of weeks from now. And we will share some on a forthcoming slide, some information about how you can provide your comments on the proposed rule that's being, the interagency proposed rule. In terms of next steps after that, the three agencies have indicated that they'll be reviewing comments expeditiously with the goal of finalizing a rule as soon as they possibly can. That could be sometime in 2022, or it could be in 2023. So why is the NPR so long? And there's just a snapshot of where it appears in the Federal Register. If you think about it, we haven't had an update to the CRA for a fairly long time. So, and we have had periodic updates in the form of guidance in what they call the Q&A that has provided tweaks and improved the understanding of what counts and eligibility under CRA over time. So there's a lot of information that has existed since about 2005. And so the update includes some of that. We also realize too that there are unique needs of various geographies and communities, and those have been added to the new regulation. And also we know that feedback from stakeholders such as yourselves has been that we need a CRA that's more clear-cut and transparent in terms of the proposal. So all those factors add a lot of detail in terms of why the version that you're seeing in front of you, if you're clicking on it, is so long and detailed. So how should you read the NPR? Well, first, have a good text search tool so you can be able to find parts of the CR or part of the NPR that you really are interested in. And then also just how it's organized in particular, I would say there's a long preamble that describes the current rule, in other words, the discussion that Molly provided, and provides the reasoning behind the proposed changes. Each section that focuses, and I'll talk about the sections in just a minute, talks about, there's a background section, there's a section around stakeholder feedback, and then there's the proposed rule that the agencies are proposing, and then that will be followed by if there are specific questions that the three agencies are looking for additional feedback on. So how to read the NPR, that's our suggestion for doing so and moving forward. We're now going to switch our focus here in terms of looking at the kind of the official slide deck as it relates to the NPR. Molly gave us a good grounding in how banks are evaluated currently, which is super helpful because some of the framework will still go forward. But we'd like to switch gears to start our discussion about what is being proposed for the updated version of CRA. So let's talk about first what the interagency objectives were in our next slide. So these are the agency's stated objectives in reforming CRA. I'll review the entire list, but I'll highlight a few that I think are really important. The NPR really builds on previous agency work and feedback from stakeholders and the research that's been done by a number of different agencies looking at specific issues. The NPR discusses the following objectives in updating CRA regs and CRA regulations. The first is to strengthen the achievement of the core purpose of the statute. And so looking back at the statute itself, that's the fact that regulated financial institutions have a continuing and affirmative obligation to help meet the credit needs of the local communities in which they're chartered. Adapt to changes in the banking industry, including mobile and online banking. I think this is really important. If we look back at the last major revision of the CRA, it was in 1995 with some tweaks in 2005. Without revealing my exact age, let's just say I was in my 20s when the last revision happened. And as you might imagine, there's been significant changes in how banks operate and how consumers access financial services since the 1990s. The agencies hope to provide greater clarity and consistency in the application of the regulations, and they hope to tailor performance standards to account for differences in bank size, business models, and local conditions. And Molly alluded to discuss how some of the current CRA is tailored to different bank sizes and business models and local conditions. And I think it's really important from an agency perspective that they carried that forward in their main objectives. They also hope to tailor data collection and reporting requirements and use existing data whenever possible. In addition, they hope to promote transparency and public engagement. And I think this objective is really important. Transparency about what is eligible for CRA consideration, for example, is really critical for CRA-based banking partnerships going forward. And lastly, they hope to confirm that CRA and fair lending responsibilities are mutually reinforcing, which they are, they're interconnected. And they also hope to create a consistent regulatory approach among the three banking agencies. And I think that's critical as well. At a high level, the proposal put forward by the agencies focuses on these key elements. As Molly mentioned before, the proposal is structured to provide basic background information, or excuse me, as I mentioned before, it's to provide background information, stakeholder feedback details, and the proposed regulation, followed by questions that the agencies are seeking feedback on. So these are the main sections and the key elements that you can find in the NPR. Today, because of limited time and really the focus of what we hope to accomplish together, I'd really like to focus on one of the key proposal elements, CD definitions, because I think it offers a clear-cut example of how the three agencies are seeking to strengthen the CRA. That will be followed by my colleague, Mishu, who will review the key elements of the NPR as it relates to financial intermediaries and those mission-driven ones like CDFIs and MDIs. He'll also share some of the questions that the agencies are asking for feedback on that should help fine-tune the final rule. So the proposal responds to stakeholder feedback about improving transparency and certainty about community development activities that are eligible for CRA credit. By providing more transparency and certainty, the agencies expect to encourage more responsive activity by banks. Under the existing CRA regulation, which Molly covered a few minutes ago, community development activities fall into four broad categories: affordable housing, community services, economic development, and revitalization and stabilization. And those are the ones that Molly covered. The agencies proposed to establish 11 community development categories that would establish specific eligibility standards for a range of loans, investments, and services. One key part of the proposal to highlight here is the primary purpose standard. It is intended to ensure that eligible community development activities are responsive to meet community needs. The standard has 2 overall prongs, and generally all activities would need to meet one of these prongs to be eligible for CRA credit. The first prong would look at whether a majority of dollars, beneficiaries, or housing units would go to one of the enumerated community development purposes. And I'll get to those in just a minute in terms of the 11. Or in cases where the majority standard isn't met, the second prong would look at whether the expressed bona fide intent of the activity meets the community development need or standard. One nuance to point out is that mixed income housing would qualify based on the proportion of housing that is affordable to low or moderate income households, with the exception of investments in low income housing tax credit, which would continue to receive full consideration. For additional clarity, the agencies propose to maintain a publicly available illustrative list of eligible community development activities. And in addition, the agencies propose a process open to banks to confirm the eligibility of community development activities in advance. So in other words, there would be a kind of a pre-review that would look at some of the qualities and information about what's being proposed before a bank would move forward. This slide lists the 11 categories of community development activities being proposed in the NPR. These categories build on current regulations, the current regulations community development definition, and incorporate key aspects of existing guidance. The categories reflect an emphasis on activities that are responsive to community needs, especially the needs of low and moderate income individuals and communities, distressed and underserved rural communities, and small businesses and farms. I'll highlight here a few provisions included in these definitions. First, to provide clear standards, the agencies propose a definition for affordable housing to recognize the importance of promoting affordable housing for low and moderate income individuals. Second, the NPR includes specific proposals for investments, loans, and other activities undertaken in cooperation with minority depository institutions, women's depository institutions, low-income credit unions, and CDFIs. This would be a new community development category that is specific to activities with these entities. Third, the NPR would apply targeted criteria for place-based activities by replacing the current revitalization and stabilization activities component of the community development definition with 6 new categories, which includes activities in native land areas. The agencies intend for these new categories to provide greater upfront clarity in terms of activities that would qualify, and to better tailor the types of activities that qualify in different targeted geographies, which include low and moderate income areas, again, distressed and underserved metropolitan areas, designated disaster areas, or native land areas, and that native land areas is new. All these place-based proposals specify that eligible activities may not displace or exclude low or moderate income residents in the targeted census tracts. So that provides one example of how the CRA NPR has changed in terms of what's currently existing, in terms of the community development definitions that Molly went over, and what is being proposed in terms of an expansion. Now, my colleague Misha will review key elements of the NPR that affect financial intermediaries like CDFIs, MDIs, WDIs, and LICUs. So Misha, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michael. Again, my name is Mishu Kokoroko, and I'm a project director here in the Community Development Department at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. And I lead some of the efforts to promote effective community bank partnerships by increasing awareness of community development trends and investment opportunities, especially those related to the Community Reinvestment Act. So as Michael mentioned, my job today is to just kind of provide you with a high-level overview of some of the provisions that we have in the NPR to support financial intermediaries like MDIs, CDFIs. And I might say that these provisions are actually responsive to feedback from external stakeholders supporting a strong emphasis on community development financing and services that support MDIs, WDIs, LICUs, and CDFIs, including equity investment, long-term debt financing, technical assistance, and contribution to nonprofit affiliates. Next slide, please. So the first one that I want to mention is the definition of what exactly is an MDI. So under the current CRA regulations, financial institutions that are not minority or women-owned can receive CRA credit for investment, loan participation, and other activities conducted in cooperation with financial intermediaries such as MDIs, WDIs, provided that these activities help meet the credit needs of communities in which such entities are chartered. And it's also important to mention that the three agencies, meaning the OCC, FDIC, and the Federal Reserve, they use a consistent definition for WDI that apply slightly different definitions of MDI. So therefore, in the proposal, to add clarity, the agencies are proposing that we use the following definition that you see on your screen. So there's three elements in the definition of MDI. An MDI is an institution in which, one, more than 50% of the ownership or control is held by one or more minority individuals. Two, more than 50% of the net profit or loss of which accrues to one or more minority individuals. So that's one element of the definition. And the second element of definition is that it has to follow the definition in Section 308 of the Financial Institution Reforms, Recovery, and Enforcement Act of 1989. And then finally, there's a latitude, there's a flexibility also that allow agencies to design or to consider an institution as an MDI. So these three factors are considered when defining an MDI. Next slide, please. Now, the second element of key provisions that I wanted to highlight has to do with the fact that the agencies are wanting to increase certainty about treatment of bank intermediary partnerships. So to increase that certainty surrounding the treatment of activities that support financial intermediaries, including MDIs, WDIs, LICUs, and CDFIs, the agencies propose some changes. So number one, investment, loan participations, and other ventures undertaken by any bank, including by MDIs and WDIs, in cooperation with other MDIs, other WDIs, or LICUs, would be considered for CRA credit. So that's one. And the second point, all activities with CDFIs will be CRA eligible. Now, in the proposal, CDFIs are referred to as Treasury Department certified. Now, regarding that second point, activities with CDFIs, we're talking specifically about lending, investment, and service activities by any bank undertaken in connection with CDFIs. At the time of the activity, we presume to qualify for CRA credit, given that these organizations will need to meet specific criteria established by the Treasury Department. Now, someone might ask the question, well, what about non-certified organizations? There's also a statement in the provision saying that organizations that are not yet certified by the CDFI fund, Treasury Division, could also qualify for CRA consideration if the activity separately met the eligibility criteria specified in a different prong of the CRA community development definition. I'll give an example. Let's say we're talking about a bank activity with a non-certified CDFI to finance a state-subsidized rental housing project, for instance, that serves low or moderate income individuals. That activity will qualify by meeting a prong of the affordable housing definition. Third key provision, next slide, please. So when you read the register, the Federal Register, you will encounter these information, impact review factors, kind of a new thing that was added to encourage CRA activities. Now, current guidance allow bank examiners from the three agencies to determine whether certain community development activities highly responsive to meeting the credit needs of LMI individuals, small businesses, and small farms. So for consistency and transparency, the agencies propose a list of what they call impact review factors for qualitative evaluation of community development activities. So therefore, they include in activities that are conducted in partnership with MDIs, WDIs, LICUs, or CDFIs as an impact factor, since these financial intermediaries are mission highly aligned with CRA's core purpose. So by including these activities, the agencies hope to further emphasize partnerships with these entities. I'll give you an example regarding the second point that I mentioned here. The NPR specified that retail lending focused partnership with MDIs, WDS, LICUs, and Treasury departments such as CDFI should be considered when assessing the responsiveness of a bank credit product, a credit product offered in a safe and sound manner in meeting the needs of LMI. For example, that will apply to home mortgage loans and small business loans that banks purchase from NDIs, WDIs, LICUs, and Treasury Department certified CDFIs. Now, these bank purchases can provide necessary liquidity to these financial intermediaries and extend the capability to originate loans to low and moderate income individuals and to low and moderate income areas, small businesses, and small farms. It's important to mention that credit products and programs conducted in cooperation with these intermediaries are only one of the three categories of responsive credit product and programs that are currently included in the NPR for qualitative consideration. Next slide, please. Now, there are some key questions in the NPR that we thought that many of you should pay attention to. The questions are, there's about 180 questions in the NPR, and the questions are numbered. So for instance, question 25 has to do with the definition of MDI. The agencies wanted your feedback on whether in the MDI definition, insured credit unions should consider to be MDIs by National Credit Union Administration. Now, question 26 has to do with activities undertaken by an MDI to promote its own sustainability and profitability. Now, should agencies give positive consideration on these activities too? And if so, should additional eligibility criteria be considered to ensure that investment will more directly benefit low and moderate income individuals and underserved communities? And another question, question 35, should a proposed factor, I just recently talked about impact factor, and factored on activities supporting MDIs, WDIs, LICUs, and CDFI exclude placement of short-term deposit, and should any other activities be excluded? So the agencies want your feedback on those questions. And also, should a criterion specifically emphasize equity investment, long-term debt financing, donations and services, and should other activities be emphasized? I know many of CDFIs are in the audience and have talked a lot about equity to loans or donations and so forth. So the agencies welcome your feedback on these questions. And then lastly, next slide, there's another question that I also wanted to touch on. That's question 105 regarding credit product and programs. The agencies would like to know if they should provide more specific guidance regarding these programs so that the activity could be considered especially responsive, or is it preferable to provide general criteria so as not to discourage a bank from pursuing impactful and responsive activities that may deviate from a specific example. And then the final slide will just show you where to go to submit your comment. We strongly encourage all of you to be able to provide your comment, either on some of the questions that I just went over, but also on other aspects of the NPR. So that ends the presentation portion of this webinar. So we would like to now open the floor to talk about some of the questions that the session attendees might have. And Michael, you want to turn on your video? Michael and I will sort of facilitate this conversation.
Yeah, Mishu, I'd be happy to. And I will stop our sharing at this point in time. Molly, I would suggest that you also come on video and unmute so we can begin responding to folks' questions. But just as a reminder, in that the period for commenting ends on August 5th. We're encouraging everyone, even if you have questions with us today, we encourage all of you to submit those questions to be a part of the formal process, and there are links here to do so. You don't need to, pardon me, submit a formal letter. You can submit comments in paragraph form and bullet points. And to mention too, all of the comments will be addressed as a part of the review process. So formal letters will be addressed, comments that receive that are paragraph form and other sorts of ways of providing text comments will all be reviewed as a part of the agency's process following the closing of the comment period on August 5th. So I just want to remind people that even if we respond to your questions today, please, please, please respond to with your formal comments as well through any of these three processes. So with that, I will stop sharing. And Mishu, I know that you and Molly have been monitoring the chat for questions, and so we can get to those.
Yes, there's one question that has to do with unbanked, and the question is, how will unbanked community be covered in the assessment areas? I can offer maybe a statement in the CRA NPR. You know, the agency is proposed to, I don't know if this really addresses that question, but I think it's an interesting provision that the questioner might want to keep in mind. The agency is proposed to allow a bank examiner judgment to determine the appropriate weighting to weighting of credit products and deposit products for purposes of assigning the institution credit and deposit product conclusion. So, for instance, if you have an assessment area with relatively high unbanked populations, this provision may apply. So the agency or the examiner may apply probably a greater weight to the bank's deposit product conclusion. And of course, the agency is seeking feedback on alternative approaches, such as maybe assigning equal weight to both components. And then again, this has to do with the retail service and test product test. Molly, any other thought?
No, Mishu, that's great. You did a good job with that. Thank you.
Are there any other questions in the chat, Mishu?
Yes, I'm trying to get onto that. Are the non-compliance institution getting tougher result for non-compliance? I don't know, Molly, you're the seasoned examiner. You want to address that question? Sorry.
So at this point, the ratings aren't changing. So the ratings that exist now are outstanding, satisfactory, needs to improve, and satisfactory, or I'm sorry, substantial noncompliance. There are provisions in the NPR, they're very detailed about how ratings will be assessed going forward. So I would suggest taking a look at those to see how those ratings are going to roll up, particularly for the For the large institutions, so for small banks, the overall process really isn't going to change very much. But for the larger institutions with, in like the JP Morgans and Wells Fargo's and US banks of the world, the way ratings are assigned to each of their assessment areas, the proposal talks about different ratings and weightings. So I don't know that it's necessarily going to be tougher results, but there is a very robust discussion there, and it's very detailed that I just don't have time to go into all of that right now.
Thank you, Molly. There's another question too. Will a CRA report be required to be on the bank's website? They are hard to find.
They are hard to find. And right now, if you go, in fact, all of the bank's reports related to their CRA evaluations are found on the Federal Financial Interagency Examination, and I forget what the C stands for. So the FFIC.gov is the place where you can find, currently, you can look up by bank their current CRA evaluation. My guess is that may not change, although I think it's Jennifer who made that comment. That would be certainly something to follow up with in terms of a comment as a part of the NPR process to make sure that the reports, and maybe Molly can allude to how some of those reports may change going forward, but that might be, oh, and Jennifer added it. You were super helpful, Jennifer. She added the FFIC link in the chat for those of you who are following in the chat, so you can go and click on that link. Molly, in terms of reporting going forward, I know you, maybe you could highlight, if you can, I hate to put you on the spot, any changes going forward on the reporting side.
Not that I'm immediately aware of. I will say that it may be hard to believe, but we do have some banks that don't have websites. There are a few of them still out there. But if you do, if you use the link that Jennifer put in for FFIC.gov, and then it breaks down the by regulator. So it'll take you to the OCC's site, or the FDIC site, or the Federal Reserve sites, and then you can look at the bank. Shameless plug for the Federal Reserve site is that you can also then look at the public evaluations. Say you want to look at all the large banks, or say you want to look, so you can pull that up, and then you can easily access multiple things. And they do, the public evaluations do go back several years, so you'll have access to those over time as well.
That's great. Thank you, Molly.
There's another question. This one is very easy. Is a copy of the recording going to be made available after the webinar? Yes.
Mishu, I know there was a question raised about, that I can't remember if you covered in or not, but about emerging CDFIs. And I can't remember if you discussed that in some of your comments, but maybe you could talk about the fact that, Treasury does certify CDFIs, but there are oftentimes a number of organizations in the pipeline to receive Treasury certification in terms of eligibility.
Yes, Treasury does have a certification process. They actually do have actually working on a recertification process, meaning that if you're already a certified CDFI, you are going to be required to go through a recertification process. So let's say that you lose your certification status. So you lose that seal of approval from the Treasury Department stating that you are indeed a mission-driven organization and that you provide specialized products and services to low and moderate income communities. An activity with your organization can still be considered providing that that activity needs a different prong of the community development definition that we have in the NPR. Let's say ABC nonprofit organization engages in an affordable housing project, and the bank was willing to work with ABC organization. That activity can be considered based on the affordable housing definition that we have in the CRA NPR, even though you are a non-certified CDFI. Does that help?
Thank you, Misha. It does. There's one question that just came in. Will the partnership let big banks off the hook for CRA? Will the partnering let the banks off for CRA? I'm not, Jennifer, maybe you could clarify your question in the chat, unless Molly or Misha wants to jump in.
Yeah, it might be nice to get a clarification of that question.
Well, we're waiting for any updates on that. We are getting approaching the time of when we want to close out the webinar. So while we're waiting for any updated questions or comments at this point in time, we want to thank all of you for participating in the webinar and listening in to get a better understanding of the current CRA, but also hear a little bit about the NPR and where it's headed. And we'll certainly remain online for any questions that come in.
You know, Michael, maybe one of the things I wanted to mention earlier regarding CDFIs.
Sure, go ahead.
Someone might say, well, what changed? You know, banks have been doing activities with CDFIs in the past, and then some of these activities received positive CRA consideration. So what's the big deal? What's the big change? I know Mali can correct me, but even an activity with a CDFI under the current guidance, an examiner would still need to make sure that that activity is going to benefit LMI communities, and then they have to be documented. So at times, the activities, maybe the bank already financed the activity, and then now, you know, they may be having a hard time to sort of document the fact that these activities are presumably going to benefit LMI communities, and that may or may not be able to receive positive CRA consideration. So I think that's a big thing right now, and because CDFIs presumably have gone through a tough certification process, therefore the agencies are thinking that all activities in cooperation with CDFIs will be eligible for CRA consideration. So I think it's a nice change for folks who are working in the CDFI field to start thinking about ways to develop partnerships with banks.
Yeah, that's right, Mishu. I think what we're trying to get to with the proposal is to provide more transparency, both for examiners and for the CDFIs, or even, you know, with some of the other 11 areas that Michael talked about for community development, just to, you know, clarify and simplify so that there isn't a lot of work that needs to be done to make sure that the activities qualify. One of the things too, as part of this, is to have being able to have a list available of activities that meet the presumption of qualifying as a community development activity, and those will be on a publicly available website. It's not going to be an exhaustive list, it's meant to be an illustrative list, but banks will also be able to work with the regulators on determining whether or not an activity meets the definition for community development as well. So Michael, I see that Jennifer sort of clarified her question a bit.
Yep.
So since the big banks can counter partnerships with MDI, et cetera, towards their CRA requirements, will the large banks have more or less requirements? I don't know that it's a matter of more or less. I think, like I was just saying, there'll be more certainty around the activities that qualify, and so it'll be easier to quantify. But how that all factors into an individual institution's ratings, it depends on that institution itself. There's a lot of factors that go into a rating.
And I do think the goal of providing greater transparency about what's eligible will provide greater certainty for financial institutions going forward to say, I will go forward with, or this activity is, I'm more certain about this activity counting as opposed to not counting. But there are, there are other factors that banks consider in terms of whether or not they're going to move forward on a project or a deal. Certainly, whether or not it fits into their financial mission, whether or not it is something the bank can do, whether or not it fits into their tax positioning and things like that. So there are other factors that banks consider as well with regard to how they're going to engage on different projects. Well, I do not see any additional questions coming in through the chat. So I will once again thank everyone for their participation today. As was mentioned previously, this webinar has been recorded and will be posted so that if people want to come back, learn a little bit more, and share it with others, that can certainly happen. I would also point out too that on our website, and maybe our technical friends Chris or Paul could pull this together quickly, we do have much of what Mishu laid out in terms of the changes being proposed in the NPR in an article as it relates to mission-driven institutions. So that article was recently published on the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis's website. And that article in narrative form kind of lays out the questions and guidance. And Landon, thank you for adding that. So the link to that article is there as well. And also that article includes information about how to comment on the NPR as well. So thank you everyone for participating today. Oh, we do have one last question coming in from Linda. Currently, can banks get credit for investments in CDFIs outside of their assessment areas if they have adequately served their assessment area? I think that's a Molly question.
Generally, yes.
I think it would go back to whether or not the activity benefits, primarily benefits low and moderate income communities or individuals.
Right.
Thank you for that, Linda. Thank you for squeezing in that question, Linda. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending our webinar today to talk about the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking around the Community Reinvestment Act as it relates to mission-driven organizations. Again, this webinar is recorded and will be on our website for folks to easily share. Thanks again for attending.